The bankruptcy auction lasted exactly 7 minutes. Victoria Sterling sat in the federal courthouse in Manhattan, watching her empire crumble as the auctioneer's gavel fell on the final bid of $30. The winning bidder, Marcus Chen, didn't even look up from his phone as he claimed ownership of what had once been a $12 million consulting firm. Just 2 months earlier, Victoria had orchestrated the hostile takeover of Marcus's tech startup, selling it off for $3 million while he watched helplessly from the sidelines. Now, as security escorted her from the building she once owned, Victoria realized she'd been playing checkers while Marcus had been setting up a chess match that began the day she'd betrayed him. Chapter 1. The partnership built on Silicon Dreams. The garage at 2847 Middlefield Road in Palo Alto had witnessed the birth of numerous tech legends. But in March of 2019, it became the unlikely cradle of what would become a cautionary tale about trust, ambition, and the devastating cost of betrayal. Marcus Chen, a 32-year-old MIT dropout with 3 failed startups behind him, had rented the space using the last of his savings, determined to crack the code that had eluded supply chain giants for decades. His vision was elegantly simple, yet mathematically complex. An artificial intelligence system that could predict and prevent supply chain disruptions before they cascaded into catastrophes. Victoria Sterling found him there on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, having tracked him down through mutual connections in the venture capital world. At 35, Victoria possessed the kind of credentials that opened doors Marcus couldn't even approach. Harvard MBA, 6 years at McKinsey, and a Rolodex that included personal cell numbers of Fortune 500 executives. She stood in the doorway of his garage, designer heels incongruously positioned among scattered circuit boards and empty energy drink cans, studying the whiteboard covered in Marcus's algorithmic equations with the intensity of someone who recognized opportunity when it presented itself. Their partnership emerged from a place of mutual necessity rather than friendship. Marcus possessed the technical brilliance to build something revolutionary, but lacked the business acumen to sell it. Victoria understood markets, valuations, and the delicate art of corporate persuasion, but couldn't write a line of code if her life depended on it. She proposed a 50-50 split, though the structure she suggested was unnecessarily complex, involving multiple holding companies registered in Delaware and intellectual property assignments that would later prove to be Marcus's undoing. He signed the papers without hiring his own attorney, a decision that would haunt him as trust gave way to litigation. Neuralink Solutions was incorporated in April 2019 and was operating from a proper office in downtown Palo Alto by June. The breakthrough came surprisingly quickly. Marcus's algorithm didn't just track shipments or optimize routes like existing solutions. Instead, it analyzed seemingly unrelated data points, social media sentiment in manufacturing regions, weather patterns 6 months out, political stability indices, even bacterial growth rates in agricultural zones, to predict supply chain vulnerabilities with 87% accuracy. When they demonstrated the system to Walmart's logistics team in September, the room fell silent for 30 seconds before the chief supply chain officer asked how quickly they could implement a pilot program. Victoria orchestrated their ascent with surgical precision. She leveraged her McKinsey connections to secure meetings with companies still reeling from the Suez Canal blockage, positioning Neuralink as the insurance policy against future disruptions. She spoke the language of corporate executives fluently, translating Marcus's complex mathematics into bottom-line impact. Within 18 months, they had contracts with 16 major retailers and manufacturers, generating annual recurring revenue of $12 million. But success revealed character flaws that struggle had concealed. Victoria began taking solo meetings with investors, introducing herself as the CEO while describing Marcus as their technical consultant. She incorporated a separate entity called Sterling Innovations, ostensibly for tax optimization, but actually as a vehicle for siphoning intellectual property. The warning signs accumulated like storm clouds. Contracts mysteriously routed through Sterling Innovations instead of Neuralink, patent applications filed with Victoria as sole inventor. And most tellingly, her sudden interest in understanding the technical architecture she'd previously dismissed as Marcus's domain. Marcus, consumed by continuous improvements to the algorithm, ignored his instincts. He discovered Victoria's separate negotiations with Apex Industries only when their shared assistant accidentally forwarded him an email chain discussing the potential acquisition of Neuralink's assets. The subject line read simply, Project Trojan, Confidential. By then, Victoria had already positioned herself to execute the betrayal that would destroy everything Marcus had built, using the very partnership agreements he'd signed in that Palo Alto garage. Chapter 2. The $3 million Betrayal. The email that destroyed Marcus Chen's world arrived at 11:43 on a Tuesday morning in February 2021, inadvertently forwarded by their administrative assistant who'd meant to send it only to Victoria Sterling. The subject line, Project Trojan, final terms should have been a warning enough, but nothing could have prepared Marcus for the contents that followed. Apex Industries, a multinational conglomerate known for aggressive acquisitions, had agreed to purchase Neuralink Solutions' entire intellectual property portfolio for $3 million, with Victoria Sterling as the sole negotiating party. The deal memorandum, already signed by Apex's chief executive, required only Victoria's signature to transfer everything Marcus had created into the hands of a company that would bury it to protect their existing supply chain contracts. Victoria had been meeting with Apex Industries executives for 3 months, conducting negotiations in hotel conference rooms and private jet cabins, while Marcus remained focused on perfecting the algorithm's predictive capabilities. She'd studied their original partnership agreement with the dedication of a prosecutor preparing for trial, discovering a clause that neither of them had paid attention to during those optimistic early days. Article 7, Section 3, buried on page 18 of their operating agreement, permitted either partner to force a sale of company assets if they could demonstrate irreconcilable strategic differences to a majority of the board. Victoria had spent weeks documenting every minor disagreement, every strategic discussion where they'd failed to immediately align, building a case that would appear compelling to anyone who didn't understand the collaborative chaos inherent in building a startup. The board meeting convened on February 28th in Neuralink's conference room, though Marcus would later describe it as more of an ambush than a meeting. Victoria had strategically scheduled it during a week when she knew Marcus would be recovering from a minor surgery, banking on his absence or diminished capacity. Despite the pain medication clouding his thoughts, Marcus attended, finding the room already filled with lawyers he didn't recognize and board members who avoided his gaze. Victoria presented her case with PowerPoint precision, each slide crafted to portray Marcus as an unstable technical genius whose erratic decision-making threatened the company's commercial viability. The emergency shareholder vote proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Victoria had secured proxy votes from 2 angel investors who'd grown impatient with the company's growth trajectory, promising them immediate returns rather than the longer timeline Marcus advocated. The final tally was devastating. 62% in favor of the forced sale to Apex Industries. Marcus watched in stunned silence as years of his work, the algorithms he'd refined through countless sleepless nights, became Victoria's property to sell. The most crushing detail was the valuation. $3 million for technology that industry analysts had valued at $30 million just 6 months earlier. Marcus's attorney, hastily retained that afternoon, delivered the brutal assessment that evening. The partnership agreement was ironclad, drafted by Victoria's former colleagues at a white shoe law firm who'd anticipated every possible challenge. The forced sale clause, while ethically questionable, was legally bulletproof. They could file injunctions, demand audits, and challenge the valuation, but Victoria had followed the letter of the law with meticulous precision. The legal battle that followed lasted exactly 19 days, burning through Marcus's savings as billable hours accumulated without producing any victories. Each court filing was met with perfectly prepared counterarguments, as if Victoria had anticipated and prepared for every possible move. The transfer of assets occurred on March 20th, witnessed by attorneys from 3 firms and documented in 47 pages of legal text. Marcus signed the papers with a hand that trembled not from emotion but from exhaustion, having spent 3 weeks fighting a battle he'd lost before it began. The $3 million disappeared immediately into Apex Industries' treasury, while Marcus received nothing except a non-compete agreement that prevented him from working in supply chain technology for 2 years. Victoria had structured the deal so that the purchase price exactly matched the company's documented liabilities, leaving zero proceeds for equity distribution. Victoria's victory lap was conducted with calculated publicity. She gave interviews to TechCrunch and the Wall Street Journal, framing the acquisition as a strategic triumph that validated her business acumen. Industry conferences invited her to speak about navigating difficult founder dynamics and knowing when to make hard decisions for company health. She never mentioned Marcus by name, referring to him only as the technical co-founder whose vision, while initially valuable, had become a limitation. The technology press celebrated her as another example of necessary corporate ruthlessness, the kind of decisive leadership that separated successful executives from mere dreamers who couldn't scale their visions. Chapter 3: 8 Weeks of Calculated Destruction. Marcus Chen's revenge began not with grand gestures or public confrontation, but with a single anomaly discovered while reviewing public financial filings on a sleepless April night. Sterling Innovations, the company Victoria had built using the infrastructure and client relationships from Neuralink, had reported revenue growth that seemed mathematically impossible. The number showed 40 million in annual contracts. Yet Marcus recognized most of the listed clients as companies that had explicitly rejected their technology. His MIT-trained mind immediately recognized the pattern. The revenue figures followed a Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical flourish that Victoria, with her liberal arts background, would never have noticed, but that screamed fabrication to anyone with serious quantitative training. The Cayman Islands connection revealed itself through a former McKinsey analyst named Jennifer Walsh, who'd worked with Victoria and now operated a forensic accounting firm specializing in corporate fraud. Marcus hired her not for revenge, but for clarity, needing to understand how Victoria had structured her betrayal. Walsh's investigation uncovered a labyrinth of offshore entities, shell companies registered to post office boxes in Georgetown, each one designed to obscure the flow of money. The most damning discovery was a series of transactions dated 6 months before the Neuralink sale, showing Victoria had been siphoning client payments into personal accounts while creating phantom invoices to maintain the illusion of corporate health. The anonymous tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission was submitted on May 15th through an encrypted browser, containing 17 pages of documentation that Marcus had meticulously assembled. He included transaction records, fabricated contracts with companies that didn't exist, and most devastatingly, emails from Victoria's company server discussing how to optimize the narrative for investor consumption, a euphemism for fraud that would resonate with federal investigators. The SEC's Enforcement Division assigned the case to senior investigator Robert Coleman, a former prosecutor known for dismantling complex financial schemes with methodical precision. Victoria's phantom contracts unraveled like a cheap sweater once investigators began pulling threads. Pinnacle Logistics, supposedly Sterling Innovations' largest client at $8 million annually, existed only as a website and a virtual office address in Nevada. Trans Global Supply Systems, another multi-million-dollar contract holder, had been dissolved 2 years earlier. The investigation revealed 32 such phantom clients, each complete with fabricated documentation, fake email exchanges conducted between accounts Victoria controlled, and even artificial intelligence-generated testimonials on the company website. The sophisticated deception might have continued indefinitely if not for one critical error. Victoria had used the same tax identification number for 3 different shell companies, a mistake that federal investigators spotted within hours of beginning their examination. The federal investigation escalated from civil to criminal when investigators discovered wire transfers totaling $18 million moving through Sterling Innovations accounts in patterns consistent with money laundering. Victoria had been washing proceeds from the fraudulent contracts through a series of international transfers, each one just below the $10,000 reporting threshold, a practice known as structuring that immediately triggered criminal liability. FBI agents joined the investigation on June 1st, bringing resources that transformed a financial inquiry into a full-scale federal case. Client departures began as a trickle when news of the SEC investigation leaked through industry channels, then accelerated into an avalanche when the FBI involvement became public. Legitimate clients, terrified of being associated with potential fraud, triggered emergency termination clauses in their contracts. Sterling Innovations lost 70% of its real revenue in 5 days. Employees, sensing catastrophe, submitted resignations faster than HR could process them. Victoria's carefully constructed empire was collapsing at a velocity that made recovery impossible. Victoria's desperate attempts to secure emergency funding revealed the depth of her predicament. She approached venture capital firms, private equity groups, and even sovereign wealth funds, offering increasingly larger stakes for smaller investments. Each potential investor's due diligence immediately uncovered the federal investigation, ending negotiations before they began. Her personal assets, frozen by federal court order on June 15th, left her unable to access the millions she'd hidden offshore. The woman who'd once commanded 8-figure valuations was reduced to seeking $100,000 bridge loans from predatory lenders who demanded personal guarantees she couldn't provide. The criminal charges filed on June 30th in the Southern District of New York included 18 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of money laundering, and 6 counts of making false statements to federal investigators. The asset forfeiture proceedings, conducted in parallel, sought to recover not just the fraudulent gains, but all assets derived from criminal activity. Victoria Sterling, who'd spent March celebrating her conquest of Neuralink, spent July meeting with criminal defense attorneys whose retainers she could no longer afford. Chapter 4. $30 in Perfect Vengeance. The federal bankruptcy courthouse for the Southern District of New York had witnessed the collapse of financial empires worth billions, but the proceedings on August 22nd carried a peculiar, dramatic weight that transcended monetary value. Victoria Sterling sat in the gallery's third row, her designer suit replaced by a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit, watching Judge Patricia Hoffman review the final documentation for the liquidation of Sterling Innovations. The company that had claimed $40 million in annual revenue just 4 months earlier was being auctioned to satisfy creditors, with federal prosecutors observing from the back row like vultures waiting for their turn of the carcass. Marcus Chen entered the courtroom at 9:15, his presence causing Victoria's attorney to lean over and whisper urgently in her ear. Marcus had registered as a creditor based on unpaid licensing fees from the original Neuralink technology transfer, a claim that Victoria's legal team couldn't contest without admitting to additional fraud. He took a seat in the creditor section, his expression unreadable as he studied the auction documents on his phone. The other creditors, mostly vendors and service providers, owed relatively small amounts and seemed puzzled by his presence, given that the expected recovery was pennies on the dollar. The court-appointed trustee, Harold Morrison, presented findings that painted a picture of corporate malfeasance so comprehensive that even seasoned bankruptcy attorneys seemed shocked. Sterling Innovations hadn't merely inflated revenues. It had operated as a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new investor funds to pay fake returns to earlier investors, while Victoria siphoned millions through offshore accounts, now frozen by international court orders. The company's actual revenue, once phantom clients were eliminated, totaled less than $800,000 annually. The technology assets, primarily stolen from Neuralink, had been so poorly maintained that their value had degraded to virtually nothing. The office lease had been personally guaranteed by Victoria, adding another layer to her mounting personal bankruptcy. The revelation that stunned the courtroom came when Morrison detailed the company's true financial position. After accounting for secured creditors, tax liabilities, and the cost of the bankruptcy proceedings themselves, Sterling Innovations had a negative net worth of $12 million. The assets available for auction consisted primarily of office furniture, some computer equipment, and, ironically, the intellectual property rights to the scheduling software Victoria had commissioned to manage phantom client meetings. Morrison's assessment was blunt. Any buyer would be purchasing not a company, but merely the right to say they owned what remained of Sterling Innovations. The auction itself lasted exactly 7 minutes, a duration that would have been shorter if not for mandatory procedural requirements. Morrison began the bidding at $10,000, a figure that drew no response. He lowered it to $5,000, then $1,000, then $500. Each reduction met with silence from the gallery. The venture capitalists who might typically circle such proceedings have been thoroughly warned off by the criminal investigation. The technology companies that might have sought to acquire distressed assets wanted nothing to do with the tainted brand. Morrison was about to declare a no sale when Marcus raised his hand, his voice carrying clearly across the courtroom as he offered $30. The symbolism of the bid was lost on no one present, least of all Victoria. $30, precisely 1% of 1% of the $3 million she'd received for selling Marcus's life's work. The amount was legally sufficient to constitute a valid bid, yet insulting enough to serve as a final humiliation. Judge Hoffman paused, allowing Morrison to seek any counterbids, but the courtroom remained silent. The gavel fell at 9:37, officially transferring ownership of Sterling Innovations and all its assets to Marcus Chen for less than the cost of a nice dinner. Victoria's realization of the orchestrated nature of her downfall came in waves during the proceedings. The anonymous tip hadn't been anonymous at all. The SEC investigation's unusual speed suggested someone had provided investigators with a roadmap. The frozen offshore accounts, typically difficult for federal authorities to locate, had been identified with suspicious efficiency. Marcus hadn't simply watched her destroy herself. He'd carefully documented her crimes, assembled the evidence, and delivered it to authorities with the same precision he'd once applied to algorithm development. Her attempts at revenge had triggered a counterstrike that was mathematical in its perfection. The criminal trial commenced in October, with Victoria facing decades in federal prison. Her defense attorney, working pro bono after her funds were exhausted, attempted to argue that the fraud had been aspirational rather than malicious, a desperate attempt to maintain a company under impossible circumstances. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The industry that had once celebrated Victoria's ruthless business tactics now treated her as radioactive, her name removed from conference programs and her Harvard case study quietly archived. Marcus Chen used the $30 acquisition not for vengeance, but for vindication. He donated Sterling Innovations' remaining assets to MIT's entrepreneurship program, establishing a cautionary teaching case about trust, betrayal, and the importance of ethical business practices. Within 6 months, he'd raised $15 million in series of funding for his new venture, with investors explicitly citing his handling of the Victoria Sterling situation as evidence of his character. The algorithm Victoria had tried to steal was eventually licensed to Amazon for $70 million, a success that Marcus achieved not despite the betrayal, but because of the clarity it had provided about the importance of choosing partners whose ambitions aligned with principles rather than just profits. Victoria Sterling learned too late that revenge is a dish best served cold, but justice can be bought for $30. She destroyed a partnership for $3 million, only to watch her empire sell for pocket change to the very man she betrayed. In the end, Marcus Chen proved that the best revenge isn't just success. It's letting your enemy's greed become their own downfall.